All right, greetings, you joyously wretched, accursed. Herle here with Reid, Teneycke, and Leichnitz. Let's get at it. Here's the rundown this week. The feds have announced a new action plan for auto.
Come on, Herle. Throw a little, once more with feeling. Come on. You're just like, all right, we're here. Let's get right into it. Come on, man.
No weekend check-in. No, how's it going?
A little life, a little spice.
I'm angry this week. I'm angry about the Apple Top 100 albums of all time list.
I knew you were going to have feelings about this.
I'm fucking angry about that. You know, I don't know, Scott, I don't know if you paid attention. They've upset the whole canon, right? I have, for 30 years, had a masterpiece in my home and didn't realize it. When The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill came out, I bought it after the Fugees. I enjoyed it. Doo-wop that thing. I'll take that. And I played it and I enjoyed it and I put it away. I did not realize it was the best album of all time. And I did not realize that no longer did Graceland even make the top 100 albums of all time. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band does not make the top 100 albums of all time. And Scott, in position number 5 is Blonde. Not Blonde on Blonde, which is normally in that position, by Bob Dylan, but Blonde by Frank Ocean. It's a deliberate insult.
I know. It is a shoveling of dirt on our coffin, Herle. Hey, Boomer, we're done. My 11-year-old, to be fair, my 11-year-old Sam had the same rant as you yesterday. Sam was very pissed off about the number 1 album. Couldn't believe it. But I think Highway 61 Revisited was 4 or 6, something like that. Anyway, so it was high enough that I could salve my wounds.
Yeah. All right. So that's what's got me in a grumpy mood. Anyway, so feds have announced a new action plan for auto theft. Minister LeBlanc was on Vassy Kapelos' show yesterday, promising to reduce massively the number of vehicles being stolen. What's the politics of this issue? Our cursed clipping comes from our own air quotes media ecosystem, incestuous as it is. On the Hurly Burly last week, researcher and data scientist Kata Ranello-Fitch gave us a brilliant tour of her fresh data on Trudeau, Poilievre, and potential new Liberal leaders. She's written a summary piece for our website under the quotes tab. Should Trudeau stay or resign, we'll break it all down. Then all kinds of U.S. pressure on the Liberal government to step up defense spending. We'll dive into that. And finally, Gordon Pinsent with our Hey Yous. Now, Jordan, it was a lovely weekend. Just because I'm in the depths, it was a lovely weekend. Did you do some lovely family things?
I did. I got outside. We went biking. We did gardening. It's great. I went to the garden center and spent a whole bunch of money. And I'm sure my kids are going to kick soccer balls all over the flowers in about a week. But it looks tip top right now. So it was a very nice weekend.
Excellent. Scott, I would ask you, but I just assume you were mired in misery as you always are.
I was, yeah. I broke it up. I changed things up on Saturday. I just went to melancholy, but then I was right back on misery come Sunday.
Well, you'll be shocked to hear that I was having a good time with Nicole, this time in Niagara Falls, for a good friend and client, Dino, who was celebrating his 60th birthday party. And it was nice to see somebody celebrating a birthday that's older than mine, which I always enjoy. It makes me feel young.
Absolutely, if anything can. So this may be, since Kory's talking about his lovely life, this may be an appropriate time for me to issue a little disclaimer to Curse of Politics listeners, which is to say that imminently I'm going to be joining Rubicon Strategies with Kory tonight. And so listeners of this show, if I disagree with Kory less than I did before, you'll know why that is, why that is the case. But anyway, just so you know, the incestuous world of Curse of Politics gets, in air quotes, gets a little even more incestuous.
Jordan, family.
Jordan and I should
also mention that we are combining forces. We're opening a nursery together. We're going to be...
You're going to put all the children in it.
Yeah, perennials. I was thinking the other kind of nursery. I was going with the gardening thing.
Maybe we can do both, right? You get a little child labor, a little, I don't know.
I think it all fits together. So
you could get the kids
we're going to do it for $10 a day.
Yeah, seems good.
All right, let's get to it. So, Scott, While we were recording last week, there was a big announcement on a holiday in Toronto, which is unusual, showing some seriousness on the part of the political actors, all levels of government, about auto thefts. The feds are promising more money for scanners and cops, along with tougher sentences for some crimes, an ongoing task force. It's a big issue, $1.5 billion industry now, the insurance industry says. Why is this a political issue, and why is it a federal issue?
I think that's really interesting. Well, first of all, we're going to be doing disclaimers and conflicts of interest. I've had my car stolen 3 times. Once I courageously recovered it from the parking lot where the thieves had driven it from my neighborhood, and I waited around for the police to arrive. And 15 hours later, they contacted me by phone. So I've had personal experience with this epidemic crime wave. I think. And actually, my story is in some ways, I think, a little bit of the criticism. Like, it feels like Range Rovers and hybrid SUVs, it feels like a very white privileged North Toronto problem. And I think that's the answer to your question, David. I think it's a federal issue because at some point, and certainly at some point when you're this deep in the polls, any issue that's on the minds of a lot of people is a federal issue. You can't be silent. You can't be inactive. You can't be indifferent to it. So I think partly there's that, and there's a lot of criticism. Well, they're late to the party, or this plan doesn't have enough of this or that or whatever. But I do think, by and large, they're making best efforts, working with cops, getting more resources, all sort of roughly the right pieces. Of course, it'll take time and blah, 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 blah. But I think there's 2 or 3 things about it. I think the issue is bigger than it looks in terms of the political map, and that's why we're seeing Dominic LeBlanc unusually making over promises about massively cutting crime. It seems like an unusually reckless promise for him to make, and I think it's because if you think about where this problem is happening, its political math is really powerful because this issue is a crime issue for people in neighborhoods like Leaside and North Toronto and in Mississauga and Brampton and Surrey's. I think in particular, a lot of women who are 35 to 65 are bombing around in the SUV, picking up the kids from daycare, and they're now hearing stories on CP24 all fucking day long about not just thefts from their driveway, but carjackings. It's on their mind. They're talking about it all the time. And so I think that it has a really corrosive effect on a vital voting constituency for the Liberals. In addition, you take a look at, again, heat map all those areas, all those ridings, all those voters. You're talking about where literally, particularly when I'm thinking about the GTA, the professional class of voters lives and breathes. This is an issue that they are being confronted with, a crime issue for the professional class. Holy fuck, they took my Range Rover, they knocked down my dollars, which I installed for $17,000, and they took my Range Rover. And so again, like that professional class, women, and then I think if you think as well about who else it's affecting, it's those men that live in North Toronto who make $250,000 plus a year, who already don't want to vote Liberal, and this just in a very tangible fashion reinforces their attitude of this fucking government can't get any fucking thing done any fucking time. And so when you add all that together, I think the political potency of this issue is much greater than it might seem at a glance, because it's very geographically specific and it seems like it's just a handful of ridings. But I think the Liberals are feeling anxious about it. And I really, really would underscore that sense of personal security for the 40-year-old mom driving the Range Rover SUV, and I think that for the Liberals is a focusing event.
Kory, generally, whenever the issue at play is a crime issue, it's good for the Conservatives and bad for the Liberals, because people tend to think that Conservatives will be more effective at the reduction of crime than Liberals are. Are the Liberals handling this issue in a way that leads to any other outcome than that?
I don't think that you can ever fight to a win if you're a Liberal on this issue, but I think you can fight to something that's less of a loss. And I think that's what they're trying to do in a similar way to conservatives on healthcare issues or perhaps environment, issues like that, where we're such an issue advantage for the other party. You can't ignore it. I'd build a little bit on what Scott's saying, but I'll add a couple of other obvious points as to why this is a federal issue. Because the feds own the criminal code, and this is obviously a crime. And second, these vehicles aren't being stolen and driven around Toronto. They're being stolen and they're taken largely, if you're in Eastern Canada, the Port of Montreal, and they're put in a container and they're shipped over to the Middle East or other markets. And so port controls like this isn't like hiding a little bag of fentanyl in a container ship full of goods. Like these are cars. Like people don't understand how you cannot figure out whether containers are full of cars when there's hundreds of them going out through the port. So, it speaks to a loss of border control at our ports. This has long been a problem. CBSA, agents and investigators being pulled back from reports of entry for a long time, having some of those things restored. But I think it plays, around the competency of government stuff. And even though this is, policing is largely a municipal issue, and when it isn't, it's largely a provincial issue. Police, I think, have really let us down. And there have been some indications of just how badly some of their suggestions around this have gone. Like saying, given that there have been a lot of home invasions to get the car keys to steal the car, having the police say, leave the car keys by the door, sounds like you're giving up on life a little bit. Sounds like you're not, going to work trying to do your job the best you can, and that your suggestion, is worthy of Chief Wembley on
maybe
on
leave
The
out
Simpsons.
a butt cake or a fresh loaf of bread, something that puts them in a good mood.
Maybe some advice on making sure that you have your car detailed regularly so that thieves won't have to do it, just to make things a little bit easier for them. I just think it speaks to an ineptitude in terms of our policing system to be able to deal with these sorts of crimes. And I think you see some points of light. I'll throw a shout out to Patrick Brown, who a lot of this stuff's been happening in Peel Region, and I think that Peel Regional Police have been all over this in a way that a lot of others haven't. But I think it requires a lot of work between the provinces, between the municipalities, and with the federal government. Like, bail reform is certainly something that needs to be looked at too. The lack of remand facilities to keep some of these criminals, because these are largely viewed as not being violent crimes. They're not prioritized to keep people in remand. And so, if you're picking up people on Thursday for stealing cars and they're back out stealing again the next Tuesday, don't be surprised that the public has difficulty thinking that you're taking it seriously. And so, insofar as this is an effort to take it seriously, I think it's a good thing, as a public policy measure. And I don't expect that the Liberals are going to get any big wins on this, but I think they're trying to mitigate the size of those losses, and I think that's smart for them to do.
Healthcare, and how, as a collective of 39 million people, we access it. I don't think I can come up with a subject that's more deeply embedded in the values of the country. Ask any Canadian. They'll give you an opinion. By the way, I have over the course of my 40 professional years as a researcher. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, doesn't just reflect those values or say the prudent things about healthcare because it shows up on a list of corporate talking points. They invest in it, substantially and continuously. The goal is simple: improve health outcomes. Their TELUS Health business unit has been a priority for years now. At home and abroad, it's grown to help almost 70 million people. We're all accessing so much more of our care online. TELUS Health Virtual Care is a big reason why, with about 5.6 million customers. TELUS Health for Good programs have helped over 1 million Canadians who otherwise wouldn't be able to access the care they need. 2 new mobile clinics were launched last year to help the underserved and homeless. Those clinics are now in 25 communities, treating 56,000 patients. TELUS Health MyCare offers free counseling to women who need mental health support. and their medical alert program gives low-income older Canadians access to a low-cost alert device at the push of a button. Those are just a few examples, Hurley-Burleyites, of the kinds of social purpose investments TELUS wants to keep making. Regulatory conditions play a big role in what they can get done. Right now, the government is laying the groundwork for a new wholesale regime. TELUS believes the best way forward is a tailored approach that considers not only regional differences, but also the companies who continue to invest in their services and the Canadians who so vitally need them. So, Jordan, Pierre Poilievre has not surprisingly rejected the Liberals' initiatives on this front, and through a spokesperson says what's really needed is to get tougher on criminals. I mean, the Liberals introduced some modest proposed changes to the criminal code for people that involve minors in this, or various things, but I presume that's not what Mr. Poilievre is thinking about.
He's talking mandatory minimums, right? Of course, as is his want. And look, I mean, I think that I agree with Scott and Kory that this is really defensive policy for the Liberals. This is about voters in Toronto having a crime issue that's front and center for them, and the government needing to appear active and engaged on it. And so I think in terms of choice of potential crime and public safety issues, this is probably an appealing one for them. But, you know, as it goes for Poilievre's proposal, I'm not really sure that people are compelled by a plan that is leaning very heavily on what happens after your car is stolen. Like the goal is to stop the car from being stolen in the first place. And actually, you know, and if you look at some of the public opinion research around the topic, we have like rare unanimity in Canada almost. So it's like almost 70% of people do not have confidence that the police are effective when it comes to dealing with auto theft. So I think you know, some of the stories you know, and like Scott's story, I think is a really great example of this, where they're just not responsive and they're not fast enough on this. So something that's leaning really heavily on you know, punitive stuff, things that are going to be maybe or maybe not deterrent. I'm not sure it's going to be all that compelling. You know, one of the pieces we haven't really talked about, but it is of course also in the mix, is what's the role of auto manufacturers in this? Yeah. So like today, if you go on Amazon, you can buy a doodad to like remotely reprogram people's keys. Like it is easier than ever for these thieves to kind of out-tech the security technology that's in our cars. And that's actually something like the federal government can regulate that. That's fixable. And so to me, it was really interesting that of all the pieces that the Liberals put in the mix for this proposal, they chose to still go with more of a voluntary consultative process with industry on that. Like, I do think that they have a bit more of opportunity here to go on the actual prevention of your car being stolen portion, which would arguably be of most interest to people. But yeah, I mean, if I'm the Liberals and I'm looking for a crime and justice issue where and I'm just being pummeled by the Conservatives on this topic, this one's appealing. It is one where they do have control. And as Kory said, actually the issue around the ports and CBSA, like that's a really important component of it. So I think that it's one that they can act on and has a pretty appealing geographic political base.
So, John, let me just come back to you a bit, because my history with trying to research these issues is that Canadians actually have a fair bit of sympathy for progressives when they talk about prevention of crime. And that obviously that makes a lot of sense to people. But where they think that Liberals, and I won't speak for New Democrats, but where they think that the progressive side falls down is in not providing meaningful consequences for people that do break the law. And so as much emphasis as they're prepared to put on prevention, when prevention doesn't work and a crime is committed, people want there to be meaningful consequences. Those can vary depending on what the action is, but generally they think that we're light on that.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that that's broadly speaking the case. And I think that for better or for worse, that's distinct from a public policy conversation about what is effective policy, because those two are often at odds with each other. But I think, you know, when it comes to this issue specifically, at the bottom of it, yes, maybe in theory, people would, are kind of in favor of tougher sentencing, and bail reform is that's a huge real issue where there's both political and practical problems. But at the end of the day, I think most people just would like their cars to not be quite so easily stolen. Like that would actually be probably a really helpful component of the discussion. And so that's something that the government, I assume because of pleas from industry not to get in there and regulate it with a heavy hand, have chosen not to mandate in this. But I would not be surprised to see that come further into the mix as this issue goes on.
But this is organized crime, though, and some of it, and especially in the international auto theft, like has long been linked to groups like Hezbollah. Like there is a terrorism element and link into this. There's an organized crime element and link into this. I think one of the other areas where there would be public sympathy, because is around going after the folks higher up the food chain in terms of these organized crime rings, because that's what they are. Like some more seizure of property, you could go, I think, a lot more aggressive in terms of that element of it, and that doesn't interfere with what you're talking about, David, around people having some sympathy for the street level folks who are actually, stealing the car. They are not the ones who are really the drivers of this, although, obviously you got to go after them.
Well, they're the drivers of Scott's car.
They're drivers of the car is in the getaway sense.
The literal drivers, but not
the literal drivers, but not the ones who are actually making most of the money in these crime rings.
So it's impossible now in the state that we're in to look at a minister like Dominic LeBlanc and not say, well, how is this advancing or not his leadership ambitions? So how do you think from a leadership candidate point of view, Dominic is performing on this issue?
I think it's a good one for him to use, right? Because it's showing that you've got some ability to reach into the other guy's field of play a little bit, and makes you look like you're less of a wet, which is sort of in the British politics, use of the term. I think Trudeau is seen as being too soft on these kinds of issues, and too much on the let's talk about violence on television and video games, and not enough hugs in elementary school is the reason why people are committing crimes, as opposed to the going after the criminals and stopping it from happening side of the equation. And so insofar as Dominic is doing that, I think it broadens the breadth of appeal, and similar to what Scott was and Jordan were both saying. I think this reaches into the suburbs in a big way, and I think it is probably disproportionately a motivator for female voters who are driving those SUVs around. I strongly agree with Scott on that.
Scott, how'd Dominic look to you?
Oh, looks strong. I agree with Kory. I think that it allows him to look a little bit different. And, when we talk about leaderships, particularly when it's an incumbent government and you're talking about succeeding in a sitting prime minister, differentiation and change is really important, and it's really delicate to manage that balance. Yes, I'm change and renewal. No, I'm not some sort of weird departure that forces existing party members to feel deliberately uncomfortable. So I think this is a place where he can safely demonstrate a different tone and sound a little harder than this government wants to, usually on these issues. But I also think I'd be cautious about how many times I go to the well, because I don't think that there's going to be big results quickly. And I don't think that you want to overplay your hand on this and own the failure as compared to signal the fact that you get it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to build on what Scott said, I think there's definitely, for LeBlanc in particular, this is something that has some political opportunity for him. He gets a lot of visibility. One of the big issues we know in terms of Liberal voters being disappointed with the government also actually has to do with competence in government, ability to deliver basic things. And so this certainly speaks to that, among that, especially that suburban liberal, soft liberal vote demographic. But it's also, this is a tough issue to solve. And it's, and the measures that are announced, I'm sure they're going to go some ways to it. They're also not going to fix it. So I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. If you become really branded to that issue, then you also have to wear any delays in that. And the reality is that we're really in such a wave of auto theft right now that has so many causes, everything from organized crime to technological change and all of these things. It's going to be difficult to turn that around on a dime. So I think overall, it's a good justice issue for the Liberals to be on, but I wouldn't maybe linger there too long if I were them.
Could I add one quick thing just for Kory jumps in, because I don't want to omit the obvious, which is any time that Dominic LeBlanc is on TV is a good time for Dominic LeBlanc. And I have no idea if he's going to run for the leadership or sees himself that way. But by that, I mean this. He's a guy who, when you watch him on television, he doesn't sound like the other ministers. He doesn't sound halting and phony and structured. He doesn't sound like he's deathly afraid that he might say something the PMO didn't approve, or that he's struggling to remember what the PMO told him to say before he went on. He looks natural, confident, and in command. He looks like a guy who can drain threes when all of those others look like they can't get across half court without dribbling the ball off their foot. So anytime he's on TV is an advertisement for his political skill and competence. And it stands in contrast to almost everyone else.
Right. The data that we're about to get into from Kyler and Helen Fitch would indicate that he would need to cut some distance from Trudeau for himself. That Canadians are looking for somebody that's not super tight with Mr. Trudeau. But
and raise his profile, I think, is the other thing in there. And this probably does both. It probably is hitting on both those notes.
Safety is one of those subjects that tends not to excite, principally because success involves things not happening. But just about nothing is more important. Our sponsor, CN, runs a network that spans North America, from the east coast of Canada to the Pacific, and down the Mississippi to the Gulf Coast. Its tracks and trains run through thousands of communities, and the duty of rolling safely and smoothly through those cities and towns is absolute. Early in June, during Safety Week, special CN trains will make a series of whistle stops across the railway's network. Teams of safety experts will meet local leaders, talk safety, celebrate employees who have logged 30 injury-free years, recognize heroic acts, and simply and plainly explain how to prevent injuries, accidents, and disasters. Hint, if you see a train coming, for heaven's sake, stay off the tracks. And CN is putting serious muscle into disaster relief. Earlier this month, the railway announced a pledge of $10 million over 10 years across its network. Climate change has brought increasingly extreme weather in recent years. Wildfire season is well underway. Count on seeing forest fire smoke again over major cities this year. So apart from its extensive efforts to prevent and contain fires, and I'll have more on that as the summer progresses, the railway is setting aside money for emergency response, community rebuilding, and infrastructure rehabilitation. The world is changing, folks. We have to adapt. That will cost money, and CN is stepping up. All right, so let's move to this deep dive that Kyler and Ellen Fitch of Relay Research did on leadership. And she published 10 takeaways from her research. All the research is public, but here's 10 takeaways that's on the Quotes website. I'll just read 5 of them. The Trudeau Liberals are in deep trouble and the budget hasn't helped. Just 14% of Canadians say the budget improved their impression of the Trudeau government. Trudeau is a drag for the party. 1 in 5 Canadians have a favorable impression of him, while 62% have an unfavorable opinion. These negative perceptions are driven by the belief that he has poor judgment, is arrogant, unethical, dangerous, and condescending. Poilievre looks good as a contrast to Justin Trudeau, but not necessarily in isolation. He is polarizing, meaning that there are relatively equal numbers of people with very favorable, 23%, and very unfavorable, 25% views of him. Among those who like him, he's believed to be smart, hardworking, qualified, possessing family values, well-intentioned, and caring about people like you. Those who dislike Poilievre most commonly find him to be arrogant, dangerous, and risky. One of the big bets the Trudeau Liberals are making is that eventually voters will see that Pierre Poilievre and his politics are distasteful and dangerous. 42% agree that Poilievre represents a scary kind of politics, But 60% believe that Trudeau represents a scary kind of politics, including 42% who strongly agree with that. 38% of Canadians would consider voting Liberal today. That number increases by 14 points when voters are asked about their likelihood of voting Liberal if the party was led by someone other than Justin Trudeau. So, Jordan, the conclusions for the Trudeau numbers seem obvious. This person should not be running. But let's look at Poilievre's numbers for a second. Most, but not all, of the top attributes associated with him are positive. Only a quarter of Canadians, though, ascribe even the top attribute to him. So lots of people who are voting Conservative right now obviously don't know very much about him. Did you see in that list of attributes, positive and negative, some vulnerabilities for him that the other parties could exploit?
Yeah, I did. And I actually think your conversation with Kylie did a really good job of outlining this. So if folks haven't had a chance to listen, it's very much worth the time. So look, his if you look at the attributes, so his top negative attributes is and as you point out, this is still not shared by anything close to a majority of voters, but it's around arrogance and then aggressiveness, which can skew either way, right? Either fighting for you or just kind of a dick, right? As we've discussed. And so I think the vulnerability that presents itself in her data that is, when we've talked about it here as well before, it's that if you're able to link that sense of arrogance, of aggressiveness, of like, he's just not a very like nice person, you're able to sort of maybe find some examples, particularly of him going at women. Those are vulnerabilities for him, but crucially, it has to be linked to what that will mean for voters. So like, what are the stakes for voters if you elect a guy like this? And this is, I think, as we've really discussed many times before, that's a bit of a missing link in some of the negatives that we've seen from the Liberals on this, making it clear for voters why somebody who has those personality traits isn't just going to be like a jerk for you, because I think that there's a misconception that Canadians don't like that sort of negativity in their politics. A lot of Canadians are fine with that, as long as they feel that it's somebody who understands them and is fighting for them, right? But where it can go off the rails is if they feel like that actually represents a disconnection and it's somebody who is punching down or is in any way going to be a risk to the things that they are counting on to come from their government. And so I think that if I were, looking at the scrying tablets there for something to shape a negative campaign, which I certainly hope everybody is, that's what I would really be looking for, is making concrete what are the stakes for voters? What could he be taking away from you? And then also linking some of that arrogance, that aggressiveness, those negatives with his history, right? So like, this guy is not, he didn't drop down from Mars 2 years ago. We have a whole history. We have a vote history. We have a history of interactions, right? Like we can paint a much more complete picture of who he is, who he stands up for, what makes him tick, and really make the case that things like, for example, what he's doing right now in the outreach to organized labor and voters, that this is not actually authentic to who he is, that he's not actually in it for working people. And his whole record suggests that. And so that's some of the picture that really has to be painted, I think, to make those vulnerabilities actually useful.
Kory, are you surprised by how much of a blank slate he still is?
Poilievre? No, I think some of it is by design. I think there is a truth as an opposition leader. You want the conversation to be more about the government and more about their record and more about their inadequacies. As soon as you start spending your time rolling out all the detailed plans of what you would do differently, etc., you open yourself up to have different kinds of conversations. And, then you're talking about a series of hypotheticals, which are not going to be as advantageous for you as an opposition leader as the hard realities and truths of, particularly in a situation where you've got a high inflation economy, huge cost of living pressures and high mortgage rates and on and on. Those are better topics to be on. And so I think a bit of lack of definition around that is probably good. Where you want to have a lot of definition, though, is who you're fighting for. Who are you there to represent? And I think you've seen a very methodical and deliberate presentation of Poilievre as a middle class guy with like a sort of middle class, lower middle class upbringing. And contrasting that with being a nepo baby trust fund kid. In the case of the prime minister, a celebrity since birth, somebody who is just inherently detached from the realities of your life. They're going to they're not going to the grocery store ever or driving themselves anywhere. They're just disconnected, and I think that's really the narrative that you're trying to lay down. That becomes increasingly more difficult as you get closer to a campaign. And when you get into a campaign, I think there will be more scrutiny, as there always is. But, as we pointed out in the past, less scrutiny than there has been in past election cycles, just because of the diminished role that the media, I think, plays in that overall environment. But the one other thing that I'd point out, if you're looking at those numbers, there is a big risk factor for the Conservatives if Trudeau resigns, and if some of that pressure is released from the system, is then you're getting more of a comparison between candidate A and candidate B, where you haven't made up your mind about either of them fully. People have made up their mind about Trudeau. That's what's very clear in these numbers. They've made up their mind conclusively, and it's time for him to go. You look at that voter ceiling number that's in that polling, 38%. That is holy fucking shit territory of, there is no way, if you've got 100% of the people who would ever even consider voting for you, that you're going to win the election. Like, it basically means winning is impossible with Trudeau as a leader. But when that jumps like 12 points or 14 points, what is it, 14? Something like that, goes up to 52. The second he leaves, then you're in a race. You've got over half the electorate who is actually willing to make a different decision. So, I look at these numbers, and I think, if I were a Liberal MP or a cabinet minister, or if I were the prime minister myself, I would be asking, am I Joe Biden? Am I the guy who's going to hand the victory to the other side because I'm so obstinate that I can't imagine a universe where I'm not in charge? It's really a deeply arrogant position that he has taken and that his team has taken.
Scott, that's all interesting, for sure. Interesting grist. I was struck by how few people still were prepared to put an attribute of any kind beside Poilievre's name, and that's after probably $20 million of advertising, much less what else he generates in terms of news. And it made me think two things. It made me think, well, maybe there's still time to define him a bit in the public mind with an advertising campaign. And then it also made me think maybe it's really difficult to punch through a message with an advertising campaign about politics right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but then you have to ask yourself, what's the alternative? I actually also think that it might show that the Conservatives are demonstrating an instinct to be candid and honest with themselves and smart about it in a way that maybe the Liberals haven't been, in the sense that they probably had research 14 months ago that demonstrated that they needed to alter and to reinforce and to buffer how he's perceived, and that they had to get out there. And so we may look at the campaign and say, it hasn't been as persuasive, as compelling, and as definitive and defining as we might have hoped it was if I was a Conservative. But the world we don't know about is, what if they hadn't sunk all that money into it? How much more vulnerable might he be? I think a couple of things. First, that pod, I know I've said this in other arenas, that pod with Kyla, I could not peel my ears off that podcast. I just thought that, we sit around and we ask ourselves, is the government doing research? Are any of these tactics that we see and that sometimes people breathlessly write stories about in the papers about, PMO says they're changing this and doing that, is any of it research based, or is it just some new person has a different gut feeling about what ought to be done and they're doing it with no real sense as to whether if you put it in front of people in a focus group, that it's compelling and that it makes sense. Because the danger of drinking your own bathwater when you're this deep into government is so pronounced. So when I would listen to Kyla's research, I was really struck by how fresh and honest and unvarnished it was, right? Like really looking at this stuff. And I just felt myself almost weeping, saying, fuck, I wish somebody would carry a brief around inside the government saying, guys, this is what we have to look at. This is where we have to start the conversation. Not with a bunch of people sitting around a room going, okay, so who's got an idea? I don't give a fuck what your idea is. I want some research. I want some honest take on the environment. And then let's start working backwards from what's available to us and what might possibly make a difference. The second thing is I was so struck by her take on Poilievre. And one thing in particular that she said about one of the ways to pry underneath the scales of his armor would be to say, you know, like, and you're thinking about that female voter, which seems elusive suddenly to the Liberals and to Trudeau, and saying, you know, he's the fucking guy who talks over you in class, at university, in high school, at work, who doesn't listen to what you say, but just uses your conversation half as a moment for him to regather his thoughts so he can burst into the conversation, tell you what he thinks. And that just felt like I thought that I could hear a bell ringing when I heard her say that. I thought, fuck, man, now there is a piece of creative insight you throw into a group of advertising executives and say, now, go turn this into a fucking vote difference maker for me. So I just thought that was really compelling. But again, and I know you want to disaggregate this conversation from the findings about Trudeau, David, and you sort of are trying to say, well, let's leave that aside. I don't think you can, because I think that when I'm looking at the stuff about Poilievre and listening to what she says and where his vulnerabilities are, and your point about maybe there's still room to advertise, I think yes. But these numbers also make me worry. And I don't think it's my business to tell Trudeau whether or not he should go. I kind of hate all these sideline liberals, you know, like me, who say, well, you know, you should push off and all that kind of stuff. I can read the polls. I don't feel it's my place because he's had 10 years of leading a government and leading elections. But the data here suggests that Liberals will fail to get Canadians to take a hard look at Poilievre as long as they have to peer around Trudeau. Like, it just feels to me like that's the truth of it. And so the last thing I would say is, if he does leave, or even if he doesn't, one thing they've got to stop doing is putting themselves in front of the camera. Like, if, you know, Kyla's research reminds me of the old principle in writing, which is show, don't tell. And if you look at all these videos that are getting news stories that the Liberals are behind the scenes are bragging about how it shows such energy on their part, they're all videos of Liberals telling Canadians what they should think about Poilievre. Take Jordan's point. Don't have a Liberal minister telling Canadians what they should think about Poilievre. Give me a piece of fucking video. Give me an ad showing Poilievre talking over a woman, blowing past someone else's opinion, being a jerk to them, not to the Liberals, because people don't care if Liberals don't like him, and people don't care if he's going to be a dick to Liberals. So I think, again, this research is so rich, and I just think there's a ton of flashing street signs here for the Liberals to follow if they would.
Wait a second. Let me be brittle. I'm not overlooking the Trudeau numbers. I just thought they were absolutely definitive that it is over, that there is no prospect for re-election here, and that nothing really matters what they do as long as he's in place. I thought that was crystal clear.
Yeah, no, it wasn't an accusation. I was just saying it's hard to have an isolated conversation about what you would do with Poilievre.
No, it was a shot. You don't like this Rubicon thing.
I don't. No. Rubicon. Oh, Caesar, show me how it's done.
But I think, you know, it's so interesting to me because really, like, what this all boils down to, I think, is that as long as Trudeau remains in place, the next election is a referendum on him, and they are fucked. But if he leaves, then it can be a referendum on Pierre Poilievre, and that is where there is some opportunity. But it's unknown opportunity, right? And that's I think the really truly impossible choice in front of the Liberals is what, you know, it's there's no guarantees there. And I thought, you know, just speaking to how Kyla was like so honest in her research, which I also found very refreshing. And I think everyone should go and check out the full report, because buried at the bottom, because of course I'm always looking for, you know, what's the upshot for my orange friends. And I think that there's a very revealing conclusion rooted in the 2018 Ontario campaign, which, oh my goodness, I hope you are all getting like adequate therapy for.
There was a campaign in 2018?
There was. It happened, David.
How did that go? I missed that. Was it some long slumber?
Yeah. It's okay.
I barely replenished my liquor cabinets.
Yeah, we're gonna
these 6 years later.
Yeah, we're gonna pour you some lemon heart, and we'll go over the numbers. But I thought it was so interesting that, you know, that the anxiety, I think, driving a lot of this research was really what happens if you get these groups of progressive voters who feel that they cannot vote for Trudeau, and then the negatives on Poilievre actually drive people to the NDP. And I thought the vote pool numbers that she dug up were actually very interesting. Because if you look at the NDP's universe there, and this is with Singh as leader, that's about 47. And if you look at the Liberal vote pool without Trudeau, okay, so with a hypothetical new Liberal leader, it's 52. So that is only a 5-point spread with the most perfect hypothetical new Liberal leader. And, you know, I think for New Democrats, that's a very interesting and encouraging takeaway there. There remains potential there for them in either scenario.
Well, I guess I'll just draw on 2018 for one clear statement to Liberals out there, which is if you think that 23 is the floor, you're wrong.
Yeah, and I think that one of the other lessons from that you've talked about in the past is, you know, if your leader is done, if the public is just done with them, even if you do the big ad campaign and you amp up the tax, the chances that you're driving people to another opposition party is very high. But denial is a feature of governments at this point in life and leaders at this point in their life. And I would say, to the team Trudeau, look at these numbers and go back and look at 2015, and you really see the mirror of it. You know, you see a country that 70% of the country, more or less, what the numbers are for Trudeau, were absolutely done with Stephen Harper. They were done. And no amount of presenting a tax on Trudeau, for instance, you know, we're obviously very involved in the ads and the research that we did in 2015. The ads weren't off the mark in terms of the attack on Trudeau. People thought he was a lightweight. People thought he was a haircut and a bit of an empty suit. But that did not match the intensity of belief that Harper was an asshole and that he was done and that they were done with him. And, you know, you can land your attacks rooted in all the research you want, but if your candidate that you are running is a dead letter, then you are equally dead.
Trudeau wasn't really running against Harper. He was running against Mulcair.
Mm-hmm. Well, right? in terms of a choice.
The anti-Harper vote was baked in. It was a question of who was going to get
in.
That's right. It was a primary. It was a progressive primary. Absolutely.
Well, and Mulcair stepped on his own dick in the last 10 days, and that was it.
Well, I mean, I think it goes further back than that, but I'm going to need the lemon heart rum for that one.
So yeah. Okay, let's just take a last little tour around something. I think I view this conversation as almost a little academic for us and our listeners rather than sharply political, because here's the deal. The pressure's ramping up on Canada on defense spending. It seems like we're going to hear about it from every American that we try to talk to on our charm offensive in the United States. The perception of Canada, NATO allies are all ramping up their expenditures and judging us accordingly. The perception of Canada about this may start to lock us out of important international trade or security or other groups. And
already has.
Right? Getting to 2% is a lot of money. It can't be absorbed without a major new revenue source or major cuts or deficit spending. We all know the politics of this. For most Canadians, defense spending is a very low priority and would lose a trade-off with almost any other spending initiative or tax cut proposal. So let's start with you, Kory. If you were in a government that felt it had to hit 2%, how would you sell that to the public?
I think you sell it on the basis of trade and a sense of responsibility about being global actors in the world. Like, I don't think that Canadians are completely irresponsible in their views about having a responsibility for global security. Canadians gather every November 11th and celebrate, celebrate's the wrong word, recognize and commemorate our role in helping to bring peace and stability to the world in two world wars. I think there is a sense that is a part of what a country like Canada does to be a responsible power. I think there's a lot of sympathy for Ukrainians and sentiment around having to make a contribution towards their effort to defend their country. I think it's particularly deeply felt within certain regions of the country where there's a large presence of Ukrainians, always have been. Like, I think of our home province in Alberta, and but equally true of places like Mississauga, where there's a very substantial Ukrainian community. So I think there is a way to sell that, but I think what's going to be increasingly clear is we are not going to have the benefits of NAFTA and things like that if we do not honor our responsibilities in other areas. I don't think that the U.S. is looking to Canada to, field a World War II size army and go out, and position troops on the front lines in Europe the way we did during the height of the Cold War. But I do think that they're expecting us to have a much larger presence in our own north. And I do know what the polling is on Arctic sovereignty and how popular that notion is for Canadians. So I think, how I would probably craft a campaign around this is a little bit of all of those. Like, we have to be responsible. We're going to provide aid and support to, friends and allies as we have in the past. And then I'd probably transition towards something around our Arctic sovereignty. It's pretty embarrassing that China has more icebreakers than we do. And, that the capacity to operate in the far north is almost non-existent for the Canadian military, almost non-existent, and has been for a very long time. So, if we want to continue to say that, that the Arctic is ours and that we have territorial claims over what is long being viewed as Northern Canada, well, we better have some ability to actually live that. And to actually field troops there, to be able to know if people are operating submarines under the ice up there, to be able to defend it in more than just lame rhetoric.
Scott, what do you think?
I don't think hardly any of those arguments that Kory just made will be compelling with Canadians when we talk about the scale of increased spending, deficit, or taxes or trade-offs. I agree that in abstract, people feel that we have strategic interest in the North, and there's a sense, an emotional sense that we need to do more and we ought to do all of that. I think that it would come down, you asked the question, how would you sell it? And I think the only way you sell it is through crisis. I think the only way you ever get the public to do something they aren't inclined to do is to demonstrate that there's a crisis and consequence of not doing it. And so I think it's all about trade. The challenge is that means you would have to start educating the public, and governments themselves would have to start communicating publicly that the inability, the failure rather, to spend the 2% on defense would cost NAFTA renegotiations, and that but there's a bargain implied, and the problem is you can't deliver on the other end. So what happens if we hit 2%? But then Trump says, I don't give a fuck, I'm not renegotiating NAFTA no matter what. I'm bringing in 10% tariffs the second I become president through an executive order. And NAFTA is just sitting there waiting for me to destroy it. And I don't care. I want you to hit 2% and I'm going to blow up NAFTA. So I think that's a challenge. But in abstract, the only way to sell this as a higher trade-off priority, I think, would be to say NAFTA's at risk and this is a mandatory requirement. We got a, so to speak, gun to our head, cannon to our head, drone to our head, that unless we boost our defense spending, NAFTA's at risk.
Yeah, Jordan, I don't think it's just the United States, I mean, I think in Europe, it's increasingly difficult for people to understand why we're around the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think our European allies are maybe just as frustrated, if not as impactful in vocalizing those frustrations as our American allies are. But look, I agree totally with Scott on this. This will just never be a political priority domestically. The scale of investment that would be required for us to meet 2%, like we have to, like it's massive, right? Like you would need another $14.5 billion annually to get there. And I have, I guess, some sympathy for the Liberals in the sense that they're cornered between really what you could argue are several decades of underinvestment. So Canada hasn't been near 2% since 1990. So this is at the feet of multiple federal governments, and at a historic moment where NATO has never been as relevant since the Cold War as it is today. We are in a very dangerous international environment with a resurgent Russia, and that's at the doorstep of our European allies. And so you have these two things really on a collision course, and it's difficult to see how you could quickly make adjustments in that unless you dramatically overhaul Canada's military procurement in order to be able to purchase equipment faster. Like there's so many issues there. There's issues in the military staffing up. We're about 10 to 20,000 personnel short. Like we have a lot of longstanding issues in our defense policy that really prevent us from quickly getting to where we need to go. But the other thing I would say is that politically, I'm not actually sure domestically how much heat the Liberals are going to face from this, because it's notable that Poilievre himself hasn't committed to the 2% target either. He's just said that they'll have a trajectory, to get there, which is more than Liberals have, but it's also not a full-throated commitment to that. And so I don't think that absent an outside crisis, and I agree with Scott that the most likely outside crisis that would spur this conversation is the election of Trump. And you can see also that within NATO, our NATO allies, like a lot of this is also just about Trump-proofing NATO, right? Like they don't know what's going to happen, and They have to put in place some investments and some guarantees for the alliance to endure, a very potentially crazy president who has said some things about NATO that really should keep a lot of people up at night. But absent that, I'm not sure what would kick off the pivots that would be necessary for us to get even close to meeting that kind of investment on any sort of an accelerated timeline.
It's not just Trump, though, and I think we have to be very clear about this. It's not just Trump. This is a bipartisan consensus in the U.S. And
I'm not saying that it's just Trump. I'm saying it's most of Europe spurring pressure. Yeah,
it's like, look, it's everywhere, and it's happening not just in the European theater. It's happening in the Asian theater. Like we're as likely to see something hot kick off in the South China Sea as we are. In the Baltic states. Like you're absolutely right to point out that we're in a very dangerous time. But it's bipartisan, and I'll throw out one idea on what a longer term plan to fund a Canadian military is, and it ties to the North and many of these other things. And just for extra weirdness, Aboriginal reconciliation at the same time. We're spending 3 times as much on First Nations now as we are on defense, and we really do need to figure out a long term funding model for First Nations. And I think it revolves around partnering them in on resource development, on power transmission, all those sorts of things, where they get a long-term funding model for self-government, for true self-government, and get out of the system of a more welfare-based, Ottawa money-based model. And I think that's one idea. There you go, world. One idea as to how we could come up with more funds and do something that's positive in the process around another issue that I think is pressing and important.
Yeah, it feels like the consequences of not doing it can be on you before you realize it. Like we're not conscious of these things. We could wake up one morning and you assume these multilateral institutions are cast in stone. Maybe they decide they don't need a G7, they only need a G5, and we're not in it. Because what do we bring to those conversations? And then pretty hard to buy your way back into that.
Well, is that not what's happening with the latest Asia Pacific Alliance? That includes Japan and South Korea and Australia and the U.S. and not us and the UK. Like it's crazy that we're not a part of the Pacific security environment in the way that we are with NATO. And there's a simple reason. and it's because we don't spend any money on it.
All right. Gordon Pinson, should we bring this thing to a conclusion?
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
Here we go. Who wants to go first today?
You go ahead, Jordan.
Scott.
I always go. Let's get Scott going.
I'll go.
You go.
All right. So there are reports in the media that Kevin Wong, the erstwhile independent former Liberal member of Parliament for Spadina, Fort York, reached out to Scott Reid.
I voted for him. That's how partisan I am.
There you have it. He reached out to Scott Reid. No, not me, listeners. Not me. The other Scott Reid. The elected, the credible, the public-oriented Scott Reid, Conservative caucus chair, and asked him about being admitted into the Conservative caucus. Says he wants to sit as a Conservative, wants to run in the next election as a Conservative. Well, I have a couple thoughts for you, Kevin Wong, and they're all covered in this. Fuck off, okay? Just fuck right off. Pierre Poilievre doesn't need you. The Liberals don't want you, and the voters can't wait to get rid of you. You lied, man. You lied. You committed a lie of omission on an incredibly grave matter, and you will never crawl out from underneath that shame. You will never be seen as credible. And I'll just say it again. This pathetic, cloying, greasy opportunism. Hey, the Conservatives, maybe they'll want me. They don't want you. They don't fucking need you. They don't need you. You're a barnacle on the hull of their boat. Goodbye. Goodbye. And
don't let the door hit you on the way out.
There you go. Well, Jordan, you wanted to follow that, so go ahead.
No, I'm just echoing the vehemence here because, like, okay. So my Hey You goes out this week more broadly to the political parties and all our elected friends in the Canadian Parliament. I would like to talk about generative AI and deep fakes and the upcoming campaign. There is a real risk. There's a real risk of this stuff actually harming our electoral process. It poses a threat to the integrity of our elections. If we were serious about these things, we would actually be looking at regulating this seriously right now. Look, we've already seen this in the US. In February, there was an incident in New Hampshire where an AI-generated voice of Biden was giving voters some voter suppressive information. We're seeing in the United States that states are racing before the election in November to regulate things like deepfakes and generative AIs used during campaigns by parties, but also by third parties. This exact same technology is being used by Russia and China and others who are interested in disrupting our elections. It's being used by the far right and hate groups. This stuff is very, very dangerous, and it's already here. And here in Canada, we have got a bill that is already outdated, that is not going to be passed in time for the next election to regulate AI. And we've already got, we saw this week that we have already campaigns and folks are using doctored news as part of political videos. And I think, you can have an argument about whether what Brendan Leslie, the Conservative MP, did in his video, people would take it seriously or not. But I am not interested in that fucking argument. I'm interested in whether we're going to agree that that is okay in our elections and what we are going to do as a country to regulate that. And we have to get out in front of that with some urgency. This is probably like the rarest moment, but I'm going to agree with Michelle Rempel on this, and she's been doing a lot of great work and writing on it. And I really think that if we don't grab the bull by the horns and act with some urgency on this before the next campaign, the conversations that we're having right now about foreign interference in the last election are going to echo the conversations we're going to be having about this type of technology and the upcoming one.
Good one. Good one. Kory?
Well, mine's going right across the screen here to you, David. My hey is to you. I'm so glad that we're going to be working more together. I think it's riders in the color green. Not since Hershey's company combined chocolate and peanut butter into one delicious snack. Paul McCartney and John Lennon. I don't know. We can let the analogies roll here, but really looking forward to working.
Really, Lennon and McCartney? Simmer fucking down.
Yeah. Well, which is which? I don't know. Yeah. Well, I would say Hall and Oates, but that was not going so well.
Congratulations on the nuptials.
Yes.
Oh, nothing's gonna change. Anyway, that's great. I'm very excited about it too, Kory, and looking forward to it. But I'm going to test our relationship right off the bat because May Hey You goes out to our home province, to Jeremy Harrison, member of the Scott Moe government. And I'm just saying, man, you've embarrassed your premier. You've embarrassed the province. Call it a day. Like your career's over, and you really have proven yourself to be a bad actor, and you've managed this in the worst political way possible. Let Premier Moe off the hook and bite the bullet, because bad shit.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't say that Jeremy is a good friend of mine, and I've gone hunting with Jeremy Harrison in Saskatchewan on many an occasion.
In what legislature?
So I have a lot more sympathy. And if I were to say one thing, and you probably agree with this, David, that his vote is only going to go up in Meadow Lake as a result of that story.
Not going to hurt his chances for re-election. I agree with you. All right, folks. Thanks for listening or watching today. Thank the three of you for being with us. It's great fun. And I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our ongoing sponsor, CN Rail. And we'll see you next week with more of the Curse of Politics. Take care of yourselves.